everyone. I'm Alvaro Rojas. I'm a senior project associate at UNU-EHS and MCII. Today here with my colleague and student of the Environmental Risk and Human Security Program at UNU-EHS, Jessica Pinheiro. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you.
Today we're going to discuss a topic that is an evolving topic, I would say, so I'm not expecting like final answers. I would just like to get, as somebody who works with data science and risk information, I would like to get your thoughts on it and more so the opportunity that you have identified for growing. The topic that we chose is intersectionality and risk analytics. Maybe for those of you who are not so familiar with the concept of intersectionality, there are different degrees and different identities or features that affect your vulnerability level. So we know that a gender plays a role, we know there are racial components to it, we know there are income component, and today saying we're doing a female-oriented study doesn't say enough. Now we know there are many levels to that. So with that introduction of what we're going to do today, do you mind introducing yourself and letting us know a little bit what are your research interests, and
Sure.
let's start there.
Yeah, for sure. So as Alvaro said, I'm Jessica. I am Brazilian Canadian, and I am finishing up my master's at the UNU-EHS. Finishing up an internship as a climate data scientist at an insurance company. So we're working on risk modeling and trying to figure out how to best include vulnerability and data science together, because it's a field that really has been underexplored. So it's really hard to include this side of intersectionality into risk analytics if our tools are not ready for it. So that's what I'm doing. But in terms of intersectionality, I think that the first thing that we need to think about is actually the step before we come up with risk-informed tools. So whether we're trying to come up with a platform or a map or any kind of governmental project, we need to make sure that we have the proper data.
Okay.
And right now there's a really big gap in disaggregated data. As you were mentioning, if we try to do a woman-informed index, well, different women may be impacted differently, whether they are from different communities, different age, different ethnicity. All of that needs to be included, and we don't have the data for it. So I think the first thing that we really need to think about is actually coming up with ways at the national level to have age, gender, and race disaggregated data so that we can see how these different indicators of vulnerability and of risk actually interact with each other.
That's a good one. Data in our experience is scarce all the way, and people would be surprised even in developed countries how this data is hard to find. Having discussions on it, there's also always the idea that every year we have more data, but we need to start talking more about quality of data, and we have to start more on prioritizing data. But I wanted to maybe bring that in kind of a different form. Maybe it's not an alternative to data, but something that can contribute with information and knowledge is representation when it's time for stakeholder engagement. Can you build on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I really think that for us to be able to get any kind of really well-informed, holistic tool, we really need to have representation all the way. So of course we need the data, but then when we have the data, we also don't have the representation in the decision-making table. Yeah. So the people coming up with these tools aren't necessarily the people who are going to be using the tool or the people who the tool is being made for. So we need to make sure that we have not just the private sector that's doing the tool, but that we have governments who are going to be implementing the tool, that we have communities there that are going to be implementing the tool, that they can all help, not just say okay, because I think that a lot of the times people say, oh, we were able to validate it with community members, but it needs to go beyond that. They need to be able to help build it. For example, are these indicators enough? What else can we add to this? Do you have data? Do you have knowledge that perhaps we can integrate into this? So I think that there's a lot of knowledge that we end up missing when we don't have that kind of representation, and the representation is missing right now. We need more women, we need more communities who are actually being impacted at the decision-making table.
Yeah, this is a message that I keep on hearing. In my opinion, one has to be mindful on how this increases costs and time need for resources in general, because that makes it more complicated to implement. And the cost benefit assessment is also missing. And then that leads to my next question for you. It's about research, something that is, we hear these conversations on and on, but there are still gaps that will allow us to implement this in a better way as practitioners and even as academics and funding agencies and private sector, right? So there are still certain gaps that we would say, if we're able to answer this question properly, we can push this integration of intersectionality in the way we do analytics. Do you have in mind, from the top of your mind, can you give me one or two questions that you think they are urgent to be addressed in research?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in terms of research, any kind of research that you do in disaster risk or even climate risk analytics, vulnerability, gender, intersectionality is going to be important. But I think that a lot of the times we miss this ideal and central idea, which is education. Because we can do research, I can do research in intersectionality and you can do research in climate analytics. But if we don't come together and we share that knowledge and we figure out how to best push that common agenda forward, we'll never be able to actually get the answer. So I think that a lot of the times research is limited when we think, okay, well, we need to make sure that the research is focused enough, but we also need to make sure that the research is open enough to be able to include different perspectives and different, and just different partnerships and different knowledge transfers idea between academia, between private sector, between public, between the community. In terms of research questions, I really, really think that there is a lot of opportunity in the climate analytics sector, whether that is with data science or artificial intelligence and traditional knowledge. We don't have that yet. We don't have, for example, different ways of quantifying vulnerability. And I think that if we are to even, for example, look ahead and think of how can we address maladaptation, we need to first figure out how can we measure vulnerability properly. So I think that that's a very key research question that we haven't answered yet. Can we use these tools in climate analytics and data science to quantify vulnerability in a way that we can use it to avoid maladaptation and other things?
Yeah, I've read quite a bit on this vulnerability index. We actually use several in the analytics team. Mostly the one we pick is the one that there is data available for, also because, as I said, the data collection is costly, and also normally you need historic data, so it is not good enough to have just 1 year representation for some of these indicators at least. I think that's a very important question. How are we going to improve our vulnerability index so that we identify the right people, the people that really needs it, and we can describe and characterize their vulnerability in a way that leads to effective action. So I fully agree with this one. As I said at the beginning, this is the point of this discussion was never to find ultimate answers on anything, just because I think even though intersectionality is a very intuitive concept, it is not, the research on that is actually quite new, I would say. So there's a lot that can be discussed in that regard. But it was really useful to have you here today to see where the discussion is going, how you see it from your perspective and based on your expertise. I, of course, encourage you to keep going on that direction, but also, as you say, stay with keep the collaboration part, because I agree with you. The concepts that we keep on developing, because as long as we are doing them in silos, they miss the exact same. They have the same problem that we keep on complaining about in other areas, right? So self-reflection on that, it's always needed. Thanks so much for your time and for stopping by.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.